Hello and welcome. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Director of Strategic Content at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to all, and especially our members, for joining us via Zoom for a conversation on the US-China relationship. This program is part of our America in 2020 series. Throughout the fall, the Council and the Financial Times are co-hosting a series of discussions on foreign policy topics central to the 2020 US presidential election. As voters confront different foreign policy worldviews, this series will convene influential voices and with distinct perspectives to examine issues with far-reaching implications for America's future. I would like to thank the Financial Times for their partnership in facilitating this programming series and hope that you can join us for upcoming conversations on the Middle East, international trade, as well as COVID-19. Before we hand off to our moderator and panelists, please note that the Council is an independent and non-partisan platform. The views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. And this program is part of the Lester Crown Center on US Foreign Policy of the Chicago Council. A generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the Center's efforts and the development of digital resources to make the Council's foreign policy content accessible across all of our platforms. Lastly, if you have questions for the panel, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end. We take your questions at ccga.live. You just type that straight into your browser, ccga.live. Follow the on-screen prompts and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question. With that, I'll hand the reins over to our moderator, James King, Global China Editor with the Financial Times.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone who has called in. I'm James King, and I'm based here in Hong Kong, looking at China, reporting about China and its impact on the world. The topic that we have for you to discuss over the next 45 minutes could be hardly more important or more topical. US-China relations, and particularly the decoupling underway between them, appears likely to shape global affairs for the next decade at least, and probably a lot longer than that. In this panel, we're going to be looking at the strategic, economic, and technology aspects of this trend. As Ian has just mentioned, we'll be opening for about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session for questions. So please do write in your questions as we go along, and we'll just pick them up on our devices. So we have an excellent panel today, full of experience from both government and policy, some of the leading thinkers on China and its relationship with the US that exist. So please let me just start by introducing our three panelists. Evan Feigenbaum is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia and for Central Asia. Lindsay Ford is a fellow with the Center for East Asia Policy in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, and formerly served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. And Jim Steinberg is Professor of Social Science, International Affairs, and Law at Syracuse University, and also served as Deputy Secretary of State from 2009 to 2011. So a really terrific panel, plenty to get stuck into. Let me just start by turning to Lindsay. And Lindsay, you may have seen the recent survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and in it was found that a majority of Americans, about 55%, say that the development of China as a world power is a critical threat to the United States. Other people are saying that the US and China now are already in a kind of new Cold War. I'm just wondering how you see it. Could you tell us, do you find this Cold War terminology accurate? How do you see the tenor of the relationship now between the US and China?
Thanks, James. It's a great question, and I think, you know, the Cold War analogy comes up a lot for obvious reasons, because When you have a sort of competitive confrontational relationship with another country, it's easy to reach for the best, most recent historical example that you can think of that seems kind of similar. But I think actually the US-China relationship today is very different, and reaching for that Cold War analogy really oversimplifies things in a lot of ways. And let me just point out two differences that I think are really important. One, I would say, is in thinking about the end state of US strategy, or when we talk about the idea of competition between the US and China, what does that really mean? In the Cold War, when we talked about containment, at the heart of that idea at the beginning, George Kennan really said that the USSR had essentially decided that peaceful coexistence with the US wasn't possible. And so to a degree, both sides were sort of pursuing a strategy that ultimately aimed at the demise of the other one. And today's reality is very different. The US and China will have to find some way to coexist as countries, and we can't develop a strategy on the US side that's predicated on the belief that we're going to fundamentally change China or its system. And so I think the question then becomes, not just how do you avoid war and coexist, but also how do you ensure that that coexistence happens on terms that are favorable to the US, our interests, our values, and those of our allies. That fundamentally is what competition is all about. Secondly, I would say that the areas of the competition are quite different than they were in the Cold War. The Cold War was, I think, much more military, much more ideological in focus. Today, I think economics and technology are at the forefront of this competition. And so it's going to call for very different tools and a really different approach. It's not simply about US-China coexistence. It's also about the fact that our allies also have to coexist with China, and in many cases, they have relatively integrated economic relationships with China. So when you think about a competitive strategy, it's both about what kind of defensive things do you do to ensure that in domestic institutions, international institutions, having China inside the tent, so to speak, isn't changing the rules of the game, corroding the openness or the transparency of those institutions in ways that would be harmful. And it's also about thinking about affirmatively, what are the things that we need to do with like-minded countries to build new kinds of cooperative coalitions around things like environmental rules, the security of space, cyberspace, and promoting open trade.
That's fascinating. It also sets me up very well to ask Evan, who obviously is an expert on tech, because Lindsay, you mentioned that some of the focuses of this rivalry will be in economics and technology. And Evan, coming to you, how do you view the outlook for the US-China tech rivalry? Already we've seen the US put more than 100 Chinese companies onto the so-called entity list, i.e. imposing sanctions of various types on those companies. Do you think that there is more to come? Or perhaps this tech rivalry will now move in some kind of different direction?
Well, first, it's great to be with you and with great colleagues. I think what's happened with technology is essentially a function of what's happened in the relationship generally. And in essence, that's what I would call the securitization of commercial flows. So as Jim knows, I mean, the security tensions have been a feature, not a bug, of the US-China relationship. They've been there for a long time. And even when Richard Nixon went to Beijing in 1972, the US and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam. So there's always been this security tension. But after China came in the World Trade Organization in 2001, economics and security essentially proceeded on parallel tracks. And if you talk to people in the markets or you would talk to people at corporates, the security issues, they were always in the background, but they were either background noise or they didn't really impinge on business models or move markets in ways that were dispositive. And so many people essentially came to the view that economic integration would not make the security tensions disappear like magic, but that they would mitigate security competition in ways that would be meaningful. But what's happened is, in the first instance, security competition not only hasn't been mitigated, it's getting worse, which is something that we can talk about, from the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait. But now, worse, the security is bleeding back into virtually all baskets of commercial flows. Flows of goods, flows of capital, people, technology, data. And these things are, in my view, being refracted largely through the prism of national security on both sides in ways that will impinge on business models and move markets in ways that they did not. Now, technology and data are particularly vulnerable in the first place because of the changing nature of innovation. If you think about the flow of innovation, say from the 1940s to the 1960s, military innovation essentially drove commercial innovation. So out of the war babies like American computing or British radar or German rocketry or American nuclear science came a lot of commercial innovations. After the 1960s, that really reversed because of revolutions in semiconductors and commercial microelectronics, which had weapons effects and implications. But now if you fast forward and you look at emerging and foundational technologies of the future, artificial intelligence-enabled applications, new synthetic and composite materials, quantum computing, new biotechnology and pharmaceutical products. These things are not just dual use, they're multiple use. And in many cases, the same technologies that can train a surveillance camera also have public benefit. The same nanotechnology that can use in a weapon system also has public benefit. And so technology is being already refracted, but then just given the nature of innovation, you see both sides thinking about it in a much more security-centric way. And on the US side, what that's meant is that whether it's flows of students and scholars into STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, there is an effort to use the policy tools available to the United States, the entity list, visa policies, restrictions that curtail co-innovation partnerships, making certain Chinese companies toxic for inbound investment or for outbound cooperation. And those executive branch tools, as Jim knows, are pretty robust. So the Trump administration has pioneered the use of those with a much more elastic definition of national security, but in a way that I think is somewhat haphazard, but nonetheless reflects this dynamic. And so that, to your very direct question, I think is going to be with us for some time, but my hope is it will become more systematic and discrete. But if you follow other Chinese companies, QQ, Alipay, they have not been designated. There are no executive orders pertaining to them, like with WeChat or TikTok, but I would predict that is where the direction of US policy is going to turn. And on the Chinese side, there's a techno-national component that's always been there. And so there's an analog to some of what you see happening here.
And thanks, Evan. I'm going to come back to you a little bit on semiconductors in just a bit, but let me turn to Jim now, because Evan, you were just talking about how the security dimension of this relationship is really front and center now. And I think one of the crucial potential flashpoints in terms of the security relationship between the US and China, as everybody knows, has for decades been Taiwan. Some people are now talking about the rising risk of a conflict over Taiwan. Jim, what do you see this, first of all, and secondly, what should US policy be in this regard?
Well, thanks, James, and great to be with all great colleagues here this evening. You know, I think first one always needs to be cautious about predicting anything about what's going on inside of Zhongnanhai, the Chinese leadership. We don't have great insight. A lot of it's speculation, a lot of it's deduction rather than real knowledge. Having said that, you know, from my own experience, I think there are two profound principles that govern the Chinese leadership's approach to Taiwan. The first is that Taiwan moving decisively to independence is absolutely unacceptable to the leadership, and they will do what is ever necessary in their view to stop it. But second, the use of force or other dramatic means is their least favorite choice about how to do that. And so their policy has been driven by both of those principles for a very long time, which is that they're not going to let Taiwan irrevocably move off to independence, but they would prefer to prevent that in any way they can, short of having to use force, or extreme coercion like an economic blockade. So if you take those two principles and apply to the current situation, they're obviously unhappy with the leadership in Taiwan now. The DPP is a party they don't trust. They don't trust the current president, notwithstanding the fact that she's been quite reasonable and moderate in many ways, given where she's coming from and the principles of her party. And they will continue to exert what pressure they can on Taiwan to try to constrain and restrain any moves towards independence. And so a lot of it will depend on what others do, because China doesn't want, I don't think, to force the issue unless it has to. And so it's constantly making a judgment about whether it needs to act, or whether if it fails to act, it will just be too late. And so it's carefully calibrating both the actions of the leadership in Taipei and the United States to see what would happen. Do I think that they somehow would feel a window of opportunity because of COVID or because of our elections? No, I don't think so. Because I think they recognize how risky this is for China and the dangers that it would employ, even if, as is the case, that Beijing now has much more military capability to have its way if it chose to do so. But I think we shouldn't take for granted that they will simply let things go without acting. And so it is a dangerous situation. And because of the growing tensions between the United States and Taiwan, and the temptation by at least some in the United States to try to put pressure on China through Taiwan, that increases the risks as well.
Thanks very much, Jim. Just a very quick follow-up on that. Some people over in this part of the world are saying that China now has kind of relative parity when it comes to a combination of potentially US and Taiwanese forces working together to defend Taiwan. Do you feel that that parity that people talk about is in fact real? Is the People's Liberation Army so big now that it could mount a credible offensive to retake Taiwan?
You know, there's a lot of focus on this, the force on force and the war games, and you'll see the reports that the war games have been run 13 times and 13 times the PLA prevails. I think that's the wrong way to think about this problem. There's no doubt that the PLA is in a much better position to prevail on some level in a conflict, and it would be much more risky for the United States and others to get involved because of the capabilities and the threat that China could pose to our aircraft carriers, but it's just not, that's not what the game is about here. I mean, even assuming that China could prevail in some narrow military sense, then what? What would others do? What would be the consequences to China? What would it do to the Chinese economy? How would other countries react? And so I don't think you can think of this simply as a kind of board game in which you see how the two militaries conflict. It would be very risky in a lot of ways in terms of China's relationship with other countries in the region. Other countries would draw huge conclusions from China doing this. Now, I'm not saying China wouldn't do it. If it felt that Taiwan was moving irrevocably towards independence, I believe they probably would. But the fact that they have greater military capabilities and might see that they could, in some narrow sense, win a military battle isn't the way I think that anybody in Beijing thinks about this. They understand this is the party controls the gun, and they understand that this is a political, economic, as well as a military contest, and that there would be huge risks at a time that the Chinese economy is already vulnerable because of COVID, because of the demographic changes in China, because of the way in which global supply chains are changing. To then take the risks of what the rest of the world might do in reaction would be very consequential. So I don't think they're thinking about this narrowly and this force on force way of thinking about it, although I don't dispute that it has gotten much more favorable to China.
That's fascinating perspective. Thank you very much. So Evan, just turning back to you, you mentioned semiconductors a minute ago. One of the big companies that's in the frame at the moment is SMIC, China's leading semiconductor manufacturer. The US has signaled that it wants to take some kind of action against SMIC, but it hasn't put SMIC on the entity list. So it's a little bit unclear exactly what the US will do with regard to MSIC. But I think the broader question here is the US becoming more and more mindful of the short-term and longer-term impacts of its tech rivalry with China? I mean, potentially, what this is doing from a Chinese perspective is redoubling China's energy and ambition to indigenize, to create its own semiconductor industry. Is Washington mindful of this? Do they look at this and think, well, we can hurt China now, but in 10 years' time, maybe we're just creating a bigger competitor in terms of, I'm just talking about semiconductors here, or is that way of thinking not really part of the game?
Well, to answer that question, you have to broaden it beyond semiconductors, and the answer to that question is no. I don't think Washington is thinking about this in a particularly long-term strategic or systematic way. And that's, you know, U.S.-China policy in general these days, it's an attitude. It's not exactly a policy, and it's a little short on strategy too, in my view. And you can see that in the tech area. For instance, you led in the setup by using the term decoupling. I've always hated the term decoupling. If you're a couple, you can get divorced. But the United States and China are not, in fact, a couple, because other countries are going to get a vote on the outcome here. One of those votes will be to decide what kind of commercial and innovation partnerships they want to have. And as I said, when I talked about the tools, the US has extremely powerful tools that it is now using, not just to securitize its own commercial and technology relationships, but to extraterritorialize and offshore the use of some of those tools. I'll give you two examples, both of which are related to semiconductors. One involves the Taiwanese company TSMC, which is a chip fab that was selling to a subsidiary of Huawei, which is China's telecom leader. The other is a Dutch company called ASML that makes ultraviolet lithography machines, which are involved in chip fab, and they wanted to license this technology. In both cases, the United States was able to lean on those companies in ways that change behavior and change the flows of technology to China and ultimately to Huawei, because the United States government seems quite determined to murder Huawei and in the bargain to attenuate China's ability to develop an indigenous semiconductor industry. Now, longer term, which is where your question was leading, I think the reason I say the US doesn't have a strategy is because it hasn't really developed a good answer to the two core questions, which is, first, does the United States government want its companies to be able to conduct technology-related business in China and co-innovation partnerships with Chinese entities of all kinds? Because if the answer to that question is yes, then they're going about this in a rather funny way. I'll just give you an example. The president issued an executive order on two companies, TikTok and WeChat. TikTok got a lot of the attention because people use it to make videos. WeChat is the more interesting one because while many people think of WeChat as a communication system, it's also a mobile payment system, as you know. And since everybody in China pays for everything using mobile payment, if you force American firms to not use WeChat Pay, whether it's people who can't pay for a Starbucks coffee or it's American firms that can't use the advertising platform, you effectively kill the ability of American companies to compete in China. And as you know, James, that executive order was rather sloppily drafted. And so in the days after it, people spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the heck the executive order meant. How broad was the sweep? Did it involve the parent companies? Was it narrowly defined? Did it implicate the payment system or just the communication system? So that question doesn't have a clear answer. The longer term and more important question is this. The United States clearly is determined to attenuate China's progress with what I earlier called emerging and foundational technologies. But the question the United States really hasn't answered is, how much technology and knowledge is the US government prepared to sequester inside the United States over the long term in order to attenuate China's progress? When you design an export control system, optimally, you should have a small yard with a high fence. But right now, you've got people in Washington thinking about export controls to design a yard the size of RFK Stadium with a high fence. And what's going to happen is the US is going to end up sequestering a lot of stuff domestically behind that wall. And it will have an effect on China's ability. And China will, as you said, react, but so will other countries. And that's what I meant by decoupling. So I think if we think about it as deintegration rather than decoupling, the US and China innovation ecosystem may become deintegrated, but that doesn't mean it will necessarily attenuate China's progress or its ability to globalize some of these industries over the longer term. But I think in semiconductors and in 5G telecommunications and in anything related to artificial intelligence, where there are a lot of firms on the entity list now, SenseTime, E2, the US decisions and policies are having a very negative effect on China's trajectory. So in the short term, yes, in the long term, I'm skeptical, and I don't see something that looks like a well thought through strategy. And they're starting to hear from companies about it.
That's it goes back to some of the comments that were being made earlier. Lindsay at the start saying the difference between this rivalry and the previous Cold War is the level of interconnectedness between China and the US. And so each of these policies, as you so brilliantly pointed out there, has knock-on effects, which then affect several other countries and companies down the chain. But Lindsay, coming back to you, I just want to bring this up to the here and now. Obviously, we're facing a very important election in the US. Would there be, in your view, different approaches to China and the rivalry between the US and China, depending on who sits in the White House after the election, please?
Thanks, James. Almost certainly. Let me say first where I think there might be similarities, and that's that I think in some ways we see coming from political leaders on both sides of the spectrum right now in the US, some degree of similarity in some of the diagnoses of the problems. And I think in the last several years, the conversation about China has shifted quite significantly in the United States, certainly from where it was at the beginning of the Obama administration when I went into government. And if you look at some of the commitments that we've seen Vice President Biden make on the campaign trail over the last year or two, holding China to account for unfair trade practices and undercutting U.S. manufacturing, committing to dealing with state-sponsored Chinese espionage, enforcing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, strengthening ties with Taiwan, all these kinds of things. It suggests to me that some of the harder line that you're seeing right now toward Beijing is unlikely to go away regardless of what administration you have. Where I think there will be important differences are in a couple of areas. One of the things I would say is one of the principal problems with this current administration, and Evan got to this earlier, is just some of the inconsistency and erraticism that you've seen in the way that they go about things, a real sort of lack of coherence in a lot of instances. And some of this has to do with the president himself. Huawei, TikTok, ZTE, you've seen the administration try to do one thing, the president jumps in and he completely undercuts it. Xinjiang, similar example. You have an administration that's really trying to press China on what it's doing in Xinjiang, and then we have John Bolton saying that, President Trump basically said, go ahead, I think you're doing the right thing here. So I think it's not hard to imagine, and it's perhaps a low bar to get over, that a different administration would be able to marshal a greater degree of consistency across government that would demonstrate that they would actually back up the rhetoric from the bottom to the top. So that's one thing. I would say, secondly, some important differences in focus. And speaking completely for myself and in my personal opinion here, I think you've seen President Biden and his campaign advisors talk about things like enhancing U.S. competitiveness, our own domestic investments, thinking about things like not shutting off the immigration pipeline that brings some of the best talent in the world to the U.S., thinking about U.S. alliances actually as a competitive advantage and using multilateralism as a source of U.S. strength rather than treating it essentially as an extortion racket, which is what President Trump has done. So I think this current administration has focused very much on, I think, the punitive aspect of competing with China. I think what you've seen coming out of the Biden campaign is a focus much more on how the U.S. essentially enhances its own competitiveness to run faster rather than simply trying to trip the Chinese.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. We've had lots of great questions coming in, but before we get to them, Jim, let me also ask you to look forward a little bit, if possible. If the US and China had the opportunity to dial back the general level of tension in their relationship, what kind of direction should they look toward to do that?
Well, it's a difficult question because, as Lindsay suggested, the relationship has deteriorated really dramatically over the last several years. And so we're in a much more difficult place where both sides fundamental mistrust about the strategic aims of the other makes it harder to make progress in any specific policy area. I mean, if you really think that each side is out to destroy the other, it's just really hard to do much in a positive direction. The first thing that needs to happen is to stop digging. We need to find ways to stop exacerbating the problems between the two countries. But I would suggest there are two different ways to think about the way forward. One is to think about the areas where there are clearly mutually shared interests, where the United States and China could work together and begin to show that despite all the differences, that there are some places where both our two countries and the rest of the world would benefit. And of course, the first place of that is COVID and public health, right? Which is that it is tragic that we are in a situation right now where somehow we're competing with each other over vaccines. We're fighting about who's going to share it with whom and how we're going to use it as a political tool, as opposed to mutually committing to the fastest, safest, most effective achievement of vaccines by putting the best scientific minds in both countries together to get it out safely, quickly, and to not only our own people, but to others. That could be done, and one could imagine that being an important first step. Other shared interests like climate change, which is one where we just can't deal with this problem unless we deal it together. So that's one set of strategies, is to focus on shared interests where we could cooperate despite the mistrust, despite the rivalry and the adversarialness. The second area is to begin to try to mitigate the dangers in areas where we have some real problems. During the Obama administration, there were two areas that President Obama tried to make some progress on because they were so dangerous. One of them was the economic espionage that China was conducting, and the idea that China was really trying to use espionage and stealing technology and forcing technology transfers to benefit China. And they tried to reach some agreements on that. They didn't hold, but it's still an area where if progress could be made, it would help to build some confidence between the two sides. The second area is in the South China Sea. You'll recall that during the Obama administration, President Xi came to Washington and made a commitment to stop militarizing the islands. He didn't live up to it. But what a positive step it would be if China would take a step to step back from its aggressive actions there in return for some progress on what has been called a code of conduct, some agreed rules about how to deal with South China Sea. It wouldn't solve the big problems between the United States and China, but both by moving forward on the cooperative side and making a little bit of progress in not deepening the tensions on some of these other issues, we could begin not to fundamentally change the relationship, but at least reduce the risks and the dangers of this current rivalry.
It's refreshing just to even think about policies that could be taken to dial back tensions. I mean, at the moment, all we ever read about, all we ever write about really is the escalating nature of tensions now. So thanks very much for that, Jim. We've got some great questions that have come in. You just mentioned climate change just there. So I think maybe I would kick off with that one. How skeptical should we be about China's zero carbon by 2060 pledge? I think this is a particularly important question because if there's one area of soft power where it seems to me China can make the running, it is in this type of climate change issue. I don't quite know who to come to first on that. Maybe Lindsay, are you looking at climate change, or I imagine Evan is. Which either of you, please.
Evan, I'm happy to. Climate is a little outside of what I often do in the defense world. I guess what I would say up front is, the challenge I think that we have with China on climate is that there's a real paradox in the fact that the Chinese are making significant investments in green tech. And actually exporting a lot of green tech at the very same time that they are producing massive amounts of coal-powered plants and exporting those too. So, that's, I think, going forward going to be one of the difficulties. Is not simply what China does at home, but also the kinds of energy technologies it's exporting abroad as well. Because ultimately, if China, even if you saw a massive transition to clean energy technologies in China, if they're then just taking all of the sort of dirty tech and selling it abroad instead of using it at home. I don't know in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the climate situation globally, if that actually nets out in a positive place.
Thanks very much. And Evan, coming to you, I think this one is probably tailor-made given your previous remarks. What should be the criteria for determining what forms of US-China decoupling? I know you hate the term. I also dislike it. But just to keep with that frame, what forms of US-China decoupling are necessary or advisable, and what forms are inadvisable or counterproductive? Is it possible to give us a sense of that?
I don't know that there's a pithy answer to that. I mean, I think there needs to be a serious dialogue between industry, the investment community, and government about the nature of technology and how elastic the notion of national security needs to be. Because where you come down on that question comes to how you think about control. I think there's clearly a set of technologies that have defense implications, and those inevitably are going to be walled off. I think there's a set of dual and multiple use application technologies, and those will either be walled off because they simply will be, irrespective of how that conversation goes, or they'll be indigenized. They'll literally be decoupled in the sense that you meant of decoupling. But I think in other areas, the reason TikTok has become a debate is because we're having a debate not about technological systems, but about data. And the core notion here is that any personal data from American citizens that touches a Chinese entity of any kind is a national security threat. And that's why you don't just have TikTok in the crosshairs, you even have things like the Chinese acquisition of GNC, which sells protein powders and creatine if you're a weightlifter, and protein bars. That's now being considered a national security issue potentially. Why? Not because of the products they sell, but because of the data. So that's a conversation that really isn't being had in a systematic way. And so I think, early in this administration, there was an effort to try to think through some of those technologies, but it wasn't especially systematic. And particularly in areas like artificial intelligence, the Commerce Department that was in charge of much of that thinking ran very quickly into the reality that it was hard to separate the defense and the commercial implications, which is what I was talking about earlier. Yeah. So I think that, the next administration, whether it's a second Trump term or a Biden administration, has an opportunity to think about this in what I would call a more systematic and institutionalized way, and also to multilateralize it, because frankly, there is no reason why the US should be thinking about export control and integration or de-integration alone. So there's some basis for that to happen. And I think, frankly, you asked Lindsay the question about a Biden administration. I think that's what would be interesting, actually, in a Biden administration, because like Lindsay and like Jim, I think a lot of the zeitgeist around US-China relations that you see now will continue. But my impression is that a lot of the people that would come into office, they're kind of institutionalizers, systematizers, and they're multilateralists. And so I think the trajectory may persist, including in the tech area. In fact, I fully expect it to. But I think the use of export controls, for instance, will be a little bit more systematic. And so there'll be an opportunity for that, or for the next Trump term to do a reset on this. But I don't see that happening. But that has to happen with industry in the room.
Yeah, that's a fascinating perspective. Sorry, Jim?
Question, which is that, we need to be smart about this and ask the right questions. The question that's being asked now is, will a particular technology help China? And to my mind, it's the wrong question, because there are lots of technologies that can help China, but our denying them, American firms selling them, doesn't mean China won't get it. When we were in government, when I was in the Clinton administration, our technology controls prohibited the sale of PlayStation 2s to China because it was the chip was too sophisticated to sell to China. Well, really, they weren't going to get this from somebody else, or wouldn't be able to acquire PlayStation 2s. And so, yes, almost every technology will have a military application. And the question is, what can we deny that is important to our security? We're acting, especially multilaterally, as Evan suggested, where denying to China will genuinely impede China's being able to do that kind of military modernization. And that kind of smart focus on where can we make a difference through technology denial seems to me is the key to being effective with these strategies rather than doing things for what are largely symbolic reasons.
Yeah, in fact, I have a running joke with a friend that they're going to put up a statue to Mike Pompeo outside Samsung headquarters in Korea, because what's happening is, you know, I mean, Samsung is delighted to pick up some of that Huawei business. So that's essentially what needs to happen. But the reality is China is very determined to indigenize and to build up a competitive strengths in a lot of these areas, including for national champion companies. And there are areas where they have the market weight and now a role as an exporter. We always talk about 5G, but just think of other systems that don't get any attention, like ultra high voltage power generation systems. It's a next generation technology. China's the dominant deployer of that technology, thousands and thousands of these lines domestically. And when you couple that market power to an export role, you can become basically a regional and global standard setter. And so one thing that's worth keeping an eye on also is the degree to which China will export its indigenous engineering standards through this role. And these will become default regional and global standards to which American firms then have to adapt. So that's part of the competitive landscape that I don't see being thought through. And it goes to your second question to me, which is how attentive is Washington to the commercial implications of some of the decisions they're making? If you neuter your company's ability to set standards in large markets, and especially emerging and frontier markets, you got a problem. And you effectively abet China becoming the standard setter.
It's fascinating. This message is coming across from all three of the panelists that really what the US needs to do is to get granular and get forensic about all of these policies towards China, particularly as they pertain to tech. And yes, absolutely on Samsung. I think they just won a couple of big 5G contracts in the US, didn't they? So you know, Samsung is trucking. I think we probably have time maybe to get in a couple of questions. One has come in here saying, is it naive to think that China will undertake liberalization efforts as they continue to advance their geopolitical position regionally and globally? I guess what we're talking about here is liberalization of the economy. I think, you know, we've seen that China is, I don't know about liberalizing that necessarily, but they're certainly inviting in plenty of foreign capital into their financial markets. Plenty of the investment banks are going in there. But I suppose shades of the Ming dynasty or something might be applicable here. Is it the case that when China turns authoritarian and when it starts to erect its physical or other sorts of walls with the outside world, does it also suffer a kind of self-suffocation when it comes to liberalizing its economy and keeping its economy animated? I don't know who might take that. Lindsay, would you be interested to have an opinion on that, or Evan?
You know, I think the reality is that the people making decisions in China today are relatively statist and have a view of the trajectory for the economy that is different than if other people were in charge. So if Zhu Rongji, who was the prime minister who essentially took China into the WTO, were making decisions about the trajectory of reform in China today, I dare say you'd have different decisions being made. That's the man that laid off 30, 40 million people out of state-owned enterprises. That's the man that strengthened market mechanisms in the economy. So that's the first thing. So I think this leadership is not inclined in that direction. The second thing I'd say is that doesn't mean there's not going to be any reform. My general rule on China is where you have reformers is where you get reform. Right now, most of the reformers are concentrated in the financial sector. The optimal sequencing of economic reform in China is not necessarily to do financial reforms first, but they are opening up to foreign financial services firms in ways that they are not opening up in terms of competition policies behind the border in other sectors. So you'll see foreign financial firms taking advantage of that, but that doesn't necessarily change the competitive landscape. The third thing I'd say is the long-term issue is really what's the nature of competition policy in China? And there I think the trajectory is not a good one and the signs are not good. And I think it really comes to what's the relationship between reform and opening. And we've always talked about those two things together in China, partly because Deng Xiaoping, the reforming leader of China, always talked about them together. But I think what's happening is those two things are being decoupled, as it were. And the trajectory China's on now is for a lot of reform, but not necessarily a lot of opening, and particularly to foreign firms. So you're going to see reforms around things like prices, the way corn is priced, or cotton is priced, or residential water is priced. And that is a reform, but it doesn't implicate the interests of foreign firms or of competition. You'll also see certain reforms around administrative reforms that increase operational efficiency in the economy. But those don't implicate the interests of foreign firms, and they don't really change the competitive landscape. So China's not opening to the kind of competition that, in my view, would be good for the economy. But I think that those kinds of structural reforms are really not on the agenda now. And unlike with the WTO, there's no externally forcing lever, the way WTO accession was, to compel the leadership to do that. And so I think, unfortunately, the landscape is pretty bleak outside the financial services sector, particularly around state-owned enterprise reform, at least for now.
Thank you very much, Evan. I'm afraid that takes us to the end of the panel. We are at, I believe 7:15 your time. So thank you very much to everyone who's tuned in, and a reminder that this recording will be available on the Council's social channels and website shortly. And so let me just end by thanking Lindsay, Evan, and Jim for what I think was a really fascinating discussion.